Okay? And again, the usefulness, one of the usefulness of doing these models is it helps you sift out and get a realistic feel for the assumptions. Then, of course, the next question is how realistic are the assumptions and so forth. So. Okay. Other questions? Other questions? Okay. What I did here was also a in-between step. Okay. One of the things that I presume something that you've probably noticed across your finance studies is that most of what we talk about in finance isn't law. I mean, of course, SEC regulations, things like that. But the capital structure and certainly CAPM and all that kind of stuff. It's not law; they're models. Okay, they're theories. Right? So there's nothing that says you have to do it that way. Okay? Ratios. Okay, when we talked about ratios, one of the things I said, part art and part science. The science part is, I think, that clearly, given a question, some ratios would be more relevant than others. But the art part of it is you can do whatever you want. Okay? Your inventory turnover ratio. Well, how are you going to calculate inventory? You can use beginning, you can use end, you can use average, you can use weighted average, multiple years, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So what I did was, like I say, an intermediate step, because the thing that I don't like about this is that it assumes all of your assets are variable, but none of your liabilities. And like we discussed yesterday, I think it's an easy argument to see, well, payables and other current liabilities would clearly be, well, they were courteous enough to let me know they had to be early. Clearly, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, clearly, payables and your other current liabilities probably are going to be variable as well. Right? So I wanted to modify these calculations to take that into account. Okay? And that's just my own pea brain. Okay? I don't know that, I mean, I'm sure somewhere somebody else has done this, but I'm not copying it from someone else. It's just what made sense to me. Okay? So for that reason, I modified this. I'm calling it the modified internal growth rate. And modified SGR, although the SGR wouldn't change. That's just my own terminology.
The Sturm rate.
I'm sorry?
The Sturm rate.
Okay, I like that. The Sturm, yeah, the status. I like that. I might have to borrow that next time around.
I'm a visionary.
Yeah, I like it. Well, if I said that, that might come off as egotistical, but since you say it, then I guess I can quote you in the future and say, well, he's the one that suggested I say it. So, but in any case, I'm calling it the modified internal growth rate. I will refer to it that way on the exam, but just under the qualifier that it's just something that I made up. So you go out in the real world and start talking about the modified internal growth rate, they probably won't know what you're talking about. Okay. In fact, talking about internal growth rate, they may not know what you're talking about. But in any case, so all I did here, I did the same thing, except I pulled the payables and current liabilities up into the current asset, up into the current asset section. So I'm simply, in other words, I'm simply netting the current liabilities against the current assets, which sounds familiar to you guys because you know that the result of that netting process is your working capital. Working capital. Now, notice that I didn't pull these short-term notes payable up there. Not operating. We talked about that yesterday. We talked about that in the statement of cash flow. Okay? So all I'm doing, again, is just netting these two, the operating current liabilities, against current assets. Okay? And when you do that, that changes your return on assets. Okay? So now, our internal growth rate, instead of 136, is 169.
Mr. Strong,
Yeah.
when you said you're netting it, you're taking it away from what?
I'm taking it out. If you look up here, I've got on what we just did, I have the payables and current liabilities where they belong.
Right.
On my modified calculations, I'm taking them out of current liabilities and putting them into,
Oh, but it's the same numbers.
yeah, same numbers, but putting them in there, and of course putting them in as a negative.
Okay.
So notice that 2009 balance sheet still balances, but it changes the total asset number. Done.
So just to clarify here, so your theory behind that is that, you know, so you can technically, it's easier to just call your supplier and be like, you know, our sales are increasing, we're doing better, you know, can you give us a bigger line of credit, you know what I mean, we, you know, show them the sales, and then obviously they've given a line of credit instead of having to go out to the markets and, you know, do
Exactly.
all that sort of financing. So it's much easier to increase that internal growth rate very simply by making a phone call to your business partners.
Exactly, and it's because recall from yesterday, these are spontaneous sources of financing.
Right.
So with these calculations, I'm focusing just on the discretionary sources of financing. So this deficit that I'm projecting down here is a deficit in discretionary financing, and I'm not worried about spontaneous for the reasons that you just stated. Okay. And for that same reason, I mean, I kind of look at this as more of an intermediate term approach. Okay. So in my view, now you kind of have a short-term planning process, an intermediate-term planning process, and then a long-term planning process. Okay. Employing them in the real world, okay, in my opinion, what that's going to tell us is that given these numbers, I mean, you can see that just looking at IGR, for example, well, our IGR in the long term, we're looking at 136. In the intermediate term, we're looking at 169. Okay? So somewhere around 1.5% is probably where our IGR is going to be falling. Clearly, if we expect sales to grow at 8%, you know, again, we're never going to be exact, but if our real range of expected growth is between, say, 6 and 9%, we need to start looking at financing.
Yeah, start leveraging up.
Need to start leveraging up. We need to start, okay, remember your dividend policy theories and your capital structure theories. We need to pay attention to how we're running our business so that when we do go hit the capital markets, they're not going to charge us an arm and a leg in interest. Said another way, if we decide to issue bonds, we better be running our business well so that we can actually sell those bonds. Because if we're not, then when we go to the market to sell the bonds, the market's going to laugh at us. And what are we going to have to do to sell those bonds? Lower your price. Same situation that Tommy's in, different market. Same thing, different market. Okay? So that's the summary of what we're doing with all this. Okay? Which kind of addresses your concern a minute ago. You know, we're calculating 1.7%. That's not going to be, you know, that's given all of our assumptions. So if everything played out exactly perfectly correct, then yeah, it would be 1.691818%. But you guys all know that it's not going to play out exactly that way.
It's not accounting, it's finance. It's forecasting.
It's not, yeah, I mean, yeah. I look at it another way. It's not law, it's theory.
Yeah.
You know, but it's a plan.
So it's forecasting that accounting and finance is accounting when everything can be finance.
Yeah. Well, and keep in mind that accounting is backward looking.
Mm-hmm.
Finance is supposed to be forward looking, which is why I don't think we're talking about forecasting enough. Now, that doesn't mean that if you go into public accounting, all you're going to do is look backwards. I guarantee you, I promise you, that's not the case. You will be looking forward, I promise you that. That doesn't mean that just because you go into finance that you don't need to know how financial statements are prepared because they're backward looking. Because you guys know, hopefully if you don't, I'm going to try and convince you of this, that when you're looking forward, the first place you start is to see what's happened backwards. That's the first place you start. So if you think that accumulated amortization is talking about an amortized loan, then you're not going to be able to read what's happened in the past accurately. And that error is going to be factored into your forecast error into the future. Okay? That's the big picture of what we're doing. Okay? So these assumptions, we're looking at 169%. Translating that to more of a practical, real-world approach, sales growth 1, 2, 2.5%, maybe something like that, we might not need to arrange financing. If we're expecting sales growth of 10%, we're going to need to arrange financing for reasons Tony just laid out. Okay? Whew. Questions? No, I love talking with you guys because you guys have some finance training, some finance intuition, and I like talking with you guys. That's another challenge of teaching this course, is I never know where the discussions sometimes are like what do you call it, brush fires? You never know where they're going to spark up. And when they do spark up, they usually take 10 minutes, which I like. And here's another one sparking up.
Yeah, I'm just curious though, because like even the technology, I mean, you look at a computer like 2 years ago, it looks like a time capsule item, and now looking at things, it's constantly changing. So how do the companies project for so much change? How do you forecast something for it?
You guys project. If you don't mind, I mean, I'm putting you on the spot.
Sure, absolutely. It's backward looking. Like you said, 2 years ago is completely different, so 2 years from now it'll be completely different again, right? So if you know your history, you're going to know your future. So it's as simple as, well, for the example I gave was that with one of our clients, Ernst & Young, one of the big four, a lot of times...
And you're with Ann Hewitt, right?
Ann Hewitt, right, yeah. A lot of times, well, pretty much every year for the past 7 years or so, at about June to July or so, they hire on 6% increase, I think it was 6, maybe 7, something like an increase in the number of employees for summer internships, because that's, it makes sense, because you're looking for something to do over summer. So historically, 6-7 years ago, for the past 6 or 7 years, there's been an increase of 3,000 to 6,000, whatever the number is. So we average out what it was, and then we kind of look where the numbers are now, and where we think they're going to be 3, 6 months, a year, 2 years from now, and we try to find that intermediate. So a lot of times it's just kind of it's been growing at this percent, we're going to add in that growth percent plus what the historical growth was, and kind of get close. So yeah, it's a lot of backward looking as much as forward.
Yeah, and I would add to that, not that I'm over there doing that, but what I would add to that is, because one of the things you said in there was what's happened in the past is going to happen in the future. And that's not necessarily true. So my personal opinion, what I would modify to that is, yeah, what's happened in the past is our starting point. But so so our growth rate in the past has been 5%. Okay, so that's our base, that's our starting point. But why might we expect that to be different in the future? Right. Well, we expect it to be different because we're getting ready to come out with the iWatch, and it's going to be a lot better than everybody thinks. So we're thinking 15%. Or, man, I don't have any more ideas. I don't know what the heck to do. So remember your life cycle probably from your, one of your management classes. What is it? Entry, growth, maturation, all that kind of stuff. Well, we could argue, and this is our theory in Apple, is that we're kind of beyond the maturation, which means we might expect 2%. My point being that the history is where we start, but the real trick to forecasting is saying, well, what might be different in the future that would change this?
I work for the company too. We do forecasting, and let's say for us, we don't do based what happened in the past.
What industry are you in?
It's a risk management Citigroup.
Okay.
So
be specific.
Yeah. Okay. So
okay.
Let's say for us, it's we don't look at the past. We look at the past for the trend to see how the trend is going.
Okay.
But it's most important to know what is going to happen in the future. What kind of products? Let's say some products they're cutting, some products they're open, and just each product you have to analyze and see what you think how they're going to grow. The future. They're looking into the future now. What happened? Just for the trend to see how the trend is going to happen.
And it's easy to say that. It's easy to say, well, how many units of these do we think we're going to sell in the future, next year? How much do you think we're going to sell? It's easy to say that.
But then, usually...
It's hard to actually...
Yeah.
But how do you account for certain things happening? Those aspects of error.
Well, and those events are arguably unpredictable, which is one reason why your forecast is never going to be exact, because you can't predict that stuff. Okay, so there's always going to be uncertainty in there. Remember that when we get into the investing section of the course, we're going to talk about risk. Remember that, because one of the things that I'm going to suggest to you is the difference between risk and uncertainty. You'll see that when we get there. He's been chomping at the bit for about 5 minutes. Phil.
No, I was just going to say, to answer your question, was, you know, you got to look at the macro and micro of your firm, whatever, and also amongst the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that kind of gets back, because remember I told you earlier, I had a former student, as a matter of fact, who works for one of the Fortune 500 now, and she's actually in the women's cosmetic section of the business. And what they did, and I think you would agree with this at your firm, is, you know, the way they actually forecast the sales is to break it down all the way down to the micro level of, you know, hey, how much do you expect to sell in the Orlando area? How much do you expect to sell in Cocoa, et cetera, et cetera? And, you know, hey, you know, Cocoa, I've saturated the market. You know, Orlando, no, I have not saturated the market. And then all of that gets rolled up into a big macro sales. And I lost track of hands, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, in response to the, you know, what about natural disaster thing, one of our, like, I've worked very closely with a lot of these clients, and one of my things was do a hands-on reworking of their contract with our company. And there's always a risk management clause, and there's something along the lines of, you know, act of God, terrorism, something, 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 like, if this happens, then we'll rework, you know, numbers and blah, blah, blah. So typically there, you know, at least for our company, there's kind of an out that, like, if something big happens, sorry, you know.
Yeah, Tony, I think you know.
Oh, I was going to say, you know, not just for like a completely random earthquake on the side of your business, but, you know, with your projections, you calculate standard deviation on those projections too. So you know what I mean? So you like, so it's not just a, you know, we're calculating 5%. We're calculating between, you know, 4.5% and 5.5%, and getting all of the, you know, trying to get a little bit of range in there and dealing with that. And you know, so you can do it that way. You know, and there's so much other like different like statistical ways you can find a better forecast. Okay. You know, and then work your way out from there.
Okay, and I completely agree with that. So in this case, going back to this, we calculated 1.36%. Okay, well, I think you're exactly correct in your sales, where you probably wouldn't have, and remember your variable budgeting stuff, you probably wouldn't have an exact number. You would probably have a range of, let's say, 1 to 4%. So you expect, that's where you expect your sales growth to be. Well, you guys know enough about statistics that if that's what we expect, then making an assumption here, we have a normal distribution around the mean of this, which would be what, 2.5%? 2.5%. Okay. Now we have our standard deviations out here. Okay. The point at which we're going to have to raise financing is 1.36%, which is going to be down in here somewhere. Now we can start assigning probabilities to the likelihood that we're going to have to raise financing.
So our sensitivity comes in if
Yeah.
this happens.
Yeah, and actually I shaded this the wrong way because we're going to have to see financing this way. Okay, so in this case, I mean, just eyeballing it, we're probably looking at 90% probability that we're going to have to raise financing.
So you start working on getting something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, it's an outstanding point. Okay, and that's why you guys take quant tools, is to have at least a feel for that kind of stuff. That's why you suffer through that course. For that reason right there. You suffer through accounting for this reason right here. I thought I saw another. Was there another hand there? Another hand? Okay. Other questions? That was a good discussion. Other questions or outstanding comments? Okay. That was a good discussion. You guys want to leave?
Yes.
That was a good discussion. What we'll do, okay, so that pretty much wraps up the first half of Chapter 5 of the supplemental, where we're projecting financing needs. What we'll do tomorrow is we're going to get into approaches to projecting sales. Now, not in the micro level way that we're talking about, but some approaches, starting with linear regression. Okay, so we'll do a linear regression primer first.